This video is brought to you by Opera. Wait, the Met? No, Opera, the browser. Opera 1 R2. Opera's back. Well, Opera's never really gone anywhere, but they're innovating and they're adding features and they're trying to pick up the pieces from everybody else in the browser war. So they're adding intelligent tab management. Well, they've always had intelligent tab management, but now the intelligent tab management is even more intelligent. Check this out, because I'm a fiend for tabs and I like organizing it. And you can actually switch themes between work tab mode and play tab mode. And also have side-by-side tabs, so you could have a data capture tab where you're making notes and looking at a web page in another tab. You can also manage your privacy. Not manage democracy, managed privacy. Really, that comes down to allowable ads. Creators depend on ad revenue. It's like, do you want to block literally everything? It's like, no, you can allow certain kinds of ads, the non-obtrusive ads. It also has some features under the ARIA banner. ARIA Translate seems to be the most interesting one because you can just highlight text and have the browser do the translation right there. It's a smooth, easy interface. I mean, I know that translation is table stakes at this point, but the ease of use and user interface of this was interesting as I was putting together this ad. So if you've got an itch for how you browse the web, check out Opera 1 R2. You might be surprised at the features they've added. Especially if you've tried Opera in the past, I think you'll like the changes. Let's talk somewhat high-end builds. Stuff that I learned in 2024 and before. Well, stuff that people stumbled over in the Level 1 forums. How about that? When they're building a Threadripper or Intel Xeon workstation. Those are overclockable now. Overclockable Xeons, yeah. Intel is doing everything they can to keep up with AMD, and AMD just keeps on coming like Jack Nicholson in The Shining. Let's take a look at cases and power supplies and motherboards and workstation configurations and cooling and storage and networking, 2500 gig, beyond 100 gig. Let's chat. Alright, first up I've got the Asus ProArt case. This is a very large case with very large fans in the front. The name of the game for cooling now when we're talking workstations generally is 140, 180, 200 millimeter fans. Okay, there are workstation builders like Falcon Northwest. This thing is a monster. If you want to see a separate video on it, I keep having to plug it and unplug it for videos, but goodness gracious. This is a crazy amount of horsepower and a very compact machine. It has a Silverstone AIO in it and a 56-core Intel Xeon CPU. I've put two RTX 6000s in here. I've done other over-the-top configurations. This is metal, it's compact, and it's basically unstoppable. If rack mount is more your thing, we've also got Silverstone rack mount cases. This is a 4U short depth, but I've got a Silverstone AIO in this, and a 192 core EPYC Turin with 384 gigabytes of memory, which is really not a lot of memory when you got that many cores. Really ought to be 768 gigabytes of memory, but oh boy, memory's expensive. This has some I/O and some other things that we'll talk about, but this is a very straightforward front to back cooling configuration. And if you order this case, it actually has a crossbar that goes here. There's some drive mounting options where it'll have some floating drives. Rack mount is a perfectly reasonable option. And yes, Falcon Northwest has rack mount options as well. The Fractal North and the North XL cases are also good choices because this is a Threadripper system. It has an AIO. This is a different type of Silverstone AIO, but it's still a perfectly reasonable system. Also, the Fractal Torrent and the Torrent Compact are good choices because, again, giant fans. A good number of the problems on the Level 1 forum with Threadripper machines, especially when we're talking about 64 and 128 gig DIMMs, had to do with airflow over the memory. Makes a big difference. And so cases like this have a ton of airflow if you configure it properly, and having those giant fans really does help. These will actually let you mount the giant fans in the top as well, so you can pull air in from the front and exhaust it out the top, or whatever combination makes you happy. Now, power supplies for these systems, you really start at around 1,000 watts. And I've got the ASRock Steel Legend SL1000. This is a good example of a 1,000 watt power supply that gives you some options and flexibility. It has the new 12V 2x6 connection. Now this is good for 1 to 2 GPUs. I mean, 2 RTX 6000s theoretically is a total of 600 watts, give or take. You have the ADA or Ampere generation RTX 6000s that are both in the market. Maybe you're going to do gaming GPUs, but you've also got, 5 of the 8-pin CPU or GPU style power connectors. And not every 1000-watt power supply has options that are really oriented toward Threadripper. The gaming versions of them give you GPU connectors, but you might not even get 2 of the CPU style 8-pin power connectors. That's right, the 8-pin PCIe power standards is different for the CPU style. That's 4 12-volt wires and 4 ground wires, versus GPUs, which is 3 12-volt wires, and then 3 ground wires, and then 2 more ground wires, which are sense pins to tell you that you can actually ask for a lot of power on the 6 wires that are there. So they're a little different. Unless you have enterprise GPUs. And then enterprise GPUs may use the CPU style power connector. That's generally the AMD stuff this side of the timeline, but older NVIDIA stuff also use that. So like the Ampere generation RTX A6000 used a CPU style 8-pin power connector as opposed to a GPU style 8-pin power connector. But most of the modern ones use that, modern 12-pin NVIDIA style connector, just like the gaming GPUs. And so if you're going to run 2 GPUs in your Threadripper workstation, well, there you go. And if you're going to run 2 GPUs like that, you really want to start at like 1200 watts, give or take. But ASRock is doing their own thing with this power supply, and I've built a Threadripper workstation around this SL1000, and that has worked out just great. But an example of a power supply that has been less great in the 1000-watt variety for a workstation type build is the Asus TUF Gaming 1000-watt power supply. And that is just because the power output configuration, the wires that it has, are not really designed for these Threadripper motherboards that have dual CPU 8-pin power connectors or more, plus the motherboard might also want supplemental 12-volt power in the form of extra 12-volt connections. And so when you have that level of demand on your power supply connectors, it can run into problems. And part of the reason that I'm pointing you toward these cases that have the options for very large fans or tons of airflow while being relatively quiet, that's the important thing, is because cooling. And it's not just because your CPU could use 400 or 500 watts. It's because GPUs, but it's also because storage and networking. And so your power supply and the cooling configuration basically should be more top of mind when you're building something with this higher end configuration than something else. And being able to pull that off in a mid-tower configuration really takes a lot more planning than just throwing everything inside a giant case with giant fans, which is easier to cool and easier to cool more quietly. But yeah, you're cooling more than just the CPU. The RAM, as I mentioned, especially if you're running Threadripper Pro, which is 8 DIMMs versus 4 DIMMs of regular Threadripper, or the Xeon workstation, the 56 core, also 8 DIMMs, also has the same cooling considerations. I mean, ASRock added 5 little cooling fans all around their CPU socket, and part of that's for VRM, but part of that's just to have airflow in the memory area as well. But if you could take care of that with 180mm or 200mm front fans, well, by all means, do it that way. You're going to need high airflow fans, and at the low end is things like the Arctic P12 Max. Arctic actually has much thicker 140mm fans that are designed for server use, more RPMs, more noise, more airflow. And that's what you need when you're doing something like that. If you want something that is server class but as quiet as possible, the Fractal Torrent is one of your very few options. You can do it in the north, but if you do it in the north, you're going to want to use the really, really big fans. If you use the Fractal Torrent, it comes with the giant fans, and I've been running that configuration with AMD EPYC CPUs, EPYC Milan, with lots of cache and tower coolers for a very long time. So the point I'm trying to make there is that when you're selecting your build, you've got to think about the airflow of the overall system, plus the power supply, plus you want to maybe get a server class power supply. You can get ATX power supplies like from FSP Group that are dual redundant, so you could have dual 900 watts where it's modular, and you take one out and you put another module in, and it's redundant, which is a lot of fun. You can also get motherboards that will take 2 power supplies, but that doesn't confer any redundancy at all. And more if the power supplies goes, the whole system is going to turn off. There's no redundancy option there, unfortunately, for your workstation configuration. You're going to be better off with a proprietary workstation that has a proprietary, 1500 watt, dual 1500 watt power supply. Now, the cooling considerations for your case also factor in for networking and storage, which we will cover in other sections. So that's enough about cases. Let's talk about storage. Most of the time when people think storage, they think M.2. I get a 4 terabyte M.2 or an 8 terabyte M.2. That's top of the line. This is our Solidigm D7 PS1010, one of the highest performance Gen 5 drives. This is our Kioxia CM7, also one of the highest performance Gen 5 drives on the market. These are available in 8, 16, 32, 64. Solidigm's got a new 128 terabyte storage device. If you have to ask how expensive it is, you can't afford it. But 8 or 16 terabytes in a form factor like this is doable in a workstation. And this interface, this is PCI Express. This is not an M.2. This is a PCIe Gen 4 M.2 to MCIO redriver card. A redriver card reconditions the PCI Express signal to work over a long wire. And so with this adapter and this cable, I can now drive a Gen 4 U.2, that's what this form factor is, at full speed, or get the PCI Express V5 version of this. Or some Threadripper motherboards have an MCIO connector on them. Threadripper Pro in the case of Asus, and Threadripper Pro in the case of ASRock. You've also got Gen 4 and Gen 5 capable E1 carrier cards. And so this is one of the ones that we're going to sell in the level 1 store. And your CM7 slots right into there. This is metal, turns this whole thing into a heatsink. This goes into a PCI Express X4 slot on your Threadripper system, and then boom, you're rocking 16 terabytes of the fastest Gen 5 storage that you can get. And this is Gen 5 storage that doesn't quit, meaning that your M.2 generally will slow down after a while. Like you copy a few hundred gigabytes to it, and it will slow down a little bit. These enterprise drives, not all of them do that. Some of them will perform at their, not their top speed, but they'll perform at a level that is significantly higher than an M.2 for a much more sustained period. They can use more power physically. They have a lot more electronics in them. I mean, this is an E3 drive because it's so wide. This is an E1 drive. They're both E1 and E3.S, but the same carrier card will carry either one of those. This connector is also the same connector as the E1.L. This is a 16 terabyte flash drive. These are not in as large a quantity as I thought, but the Open Compute Consortium companies, that's Meta, Facebook, Amazon, etc., these are older Gen 3 16 terabyte drives. They were buying these 4 years ago, 5 years ago. These are being surplus now. And these are still very good drives. They're generally TLC drives. This particular one is from Solidigm, and yeah, I can build this giant contraption. Now this is an E1.L drive that has a U.2 style connector, and yes, this will work perfectly with my M.2 adapter. And so I have this ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous giant M.2 that is 16 terabytes in this configuration. By the way, these also get warm, so cooling. This gets very warm. Cooling is an issue. For this is more heatsink than circuit board because cooling. Oh, and our Super Micro motherboard, that's, again, we're now in like true workstation. This is a literal server motherboard. It has many MCIO connectors that are 8 PCI Express lanes. And yes, you can get cables to go from those to 2 U.2 connections. And so you can build, redundant RAID 1 mirrored drive for all of your important stuff, or a RAID 10 array, or whatever it is that you need for your computational, desires. Basically, I figure if you're watching this video and you're contemplating building one of these, you make money with your computer. You don't just do this for the lulz. It's like, okay, I need to build this thing to do my work faster and better. What are my options? And you actually have a whole universe of options other than M.2. M.2 can be perfectly fine for a boot drive, but if you've got a big giant SQL database or lots of random I.O., you got a lot more options. Sometimes you can bridge the gap with some of the stuff that ICDoc sells, videos that we've covered in the past. This is a 4-up U.2 connector that is Gen 4 compatible, And so you can use this with cables from your motherboard in order to be able to mount drives like this Solidigm drive. 4 of those in a single 5¼ inch bay in your workstation, and you're good to go. And some of these workstations really do have these kinds of options. ICDock even has options for M.2. This is one of the best M.2 carrier card adapters that I've seen. Your motherboard has to support bifurcation, but I've run 4 Crucial T705 4TB M.2 in this, and then this also gives you 16 terabytes on a single PCI Express by 16 interface card. And because it's 4 Gen 5 drives, this is a force to be reckoned with when you need raw read and write speed, because each drive is doing 14, 15 gigabytes per second, so 30, 60 gigabytes per second. This is going to be something that you really ideally are going to run on an 8 memory channel platform, because you're getting into how much memory bandwidth you have with that much I/O, because those PCIe lanes are fast. Every group of 4 lanes is basically a memory channel, right? So you got a lot of options for storage. What about networking? All these motherboards have onboard 10 gig. That should tell you how pedestrian that is. You can go 25 or 100 gig. 25 gig is easy. It's plug and play. It's well supported on Windows and Linux these days. There's no reason that you shouldn't run 25 gig Ethernet. Let's dive into 25 gig Ethernet. What does that look like? This is 25 gigabit. This is called SFP28, this connector, and it's fiber optic. Although you can get pre-made fiber optic or even copper patch cables that use this connector. You don't necessarily need a 25 gigabit switch. If you've got 3 or fewer devices you need to connect, you can just connect one card to another card to another card directly. I did that for an inexpensive 25 gig garbage NAS in a video a while ago. 25 gigabit means you can move 2.5 gigabytes per second per interface. And it used to be true that when we're talking about networking this fast, you would need exotic things like jumbo packets, or to configure special network parameters, or to set up a storage VLAN, or all of the above. Those things still help. I mean, if you want a gold star to go through the extra effort to set up a separate storage network, it is nice. Those things are more efficient. They lead to lower CPU utilization. But if you don't want to do that, these processors are fast enough, they can move 2.5 gigabytes per second easily. Also, Windows as an operating system has come miles and miles the last 2 or 3 years to be able to move files on their file share at 25 gigabit. It's basically plug and play. It's so exciting that I've actually reached out to Micro Center to suggest that maybe they should offer rentable fiber optic splicing and pulling tools for home and enthusiast users in order to be able to pull bundles of fiber optic cables through their homes and small businesses. Even Ingenious wants to get in on it. This is a 25/100 gigabit aggregation switch. Broadcom has mostly had the monopoly here on various chipsets that could do 100 gigabit internally. And this switch it's 100 gigabit internally, but it breaks out some of the 100 gigabit ports into 25 gigabit ports. Well, actually 48 25 gig ports and 6 100 gig ports. That's a popular configuration. You can take 4 of the 25 gig ports in a special cable to recombine them into a 100 gig connection, so you can do 10 gigabytes per second. Windows still struggles with network interfaces that fast, but 50 gigabit dual 25 gig you can do basically all day long. And these aggregation switches are more affordable than ever. In fact, they cost only a little more than 10 gig switches did just 5 years ago. Like, we've almost had this sort of weird log jam with 10 gigabit. Like, 10 gigabit wasn't showing up on networks. Even today, they're reluctantly included on desktop class 10 gigabit motherboards. And then boom, 25 gig. Well, 25 gig PCIe cards, you got all the PCIe lanes on a nice Threadripper machine. You can use 25 gig switch, and you should. And there's a whole bunch of options. There's even lower cost options from MikroTik and others, but they're not going to have as many ports. And the manageability is not going to be quite the same experience as Unify. Ubiquiti wants to make it as easy as possible, and they certainly do with their aggregation equipment. And if you need redundancy, you can stack 2 of these, and that is easier than it's ever been. So there you go. If you're building a high-end workstation, or you're recycling parts in the future from something that once was a high-end workstation, welcome. And for workstation stuff, like if you're an enthusiast and you made it this far in this video and you want an enthusiast workstation, you really should look at Falcon Northwest, because they'll build you an enthusiast workstation. One is actually overclocking capable, that Silverstone AIO, in a way that you're not going to get from Dell or Lenovo or anything like that. And it is stable. My experience with it it's been stable and good, and I've done my machine learning stuff on it. It's been great. It's fantastic. But also, I've got a soft spot for DIYers as well, and you can get it done if you DIY, and DIY is a lot of fun, but sometimes ain't nobody got time for that, and that makes sense. So I'm What List Level 1. Check out the Level 1 forums, because there's a lot of like-minded folks there that love building this kind of stuff. I'm signing out, and I'll see you there, and yeah, fun times.